All right, we are back with a new episode of React 30. I am your host, Michael Jackson, my co-host, Ryan Florence.
Howdy.
And our special guest today, very special guest, is John Gold. He is working out of the Airbnb headquarters right now. Say hi, John.
Hi, John.
He must be a dad.
I'm not, but I'm ready.
Yeah, you're definitely ready.
Welcome to the show. Thanks for taking the time to be with us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's great to come on.
So
I got to say, this is a little bit weird. Like, I've been talking to you, John, for a long time online, but I don't think we've ever talked like in real time.
Yeah, so I've never seen your face move, and I've also never met you in real life. So I was under the impression that you were just a Twitter profile and maybe a GitHub profile, but you're at least animated. So.
All right, sorry, Michael.
Interrupted
your intro.
Well, no, I mean, one of the points of this show is to like break down that barrier, right? There are so many people I feel like that I interact with now online. You know, Jason Miller we've had on the show, Brian Vaughn.
Yeah.
And a lot of these people who they tweet a lot and you're talking to them all the time on Twitter, but when you finally get them on the show, then it's like, it's really cool. I think it just kind of helps to, we had Leland on the show a while back. Just kind of helps to sort of break down that barrier. So it's good to have you on the show. So we are, so I saw, a couple of weeks ago, and it was funny because Ryan and I sort of independently came to this idea when we both saw React Sketch sort of independently from one another. We both came to the idea that, man, we really got to have this guy on the show. We got to talk to him about this because we think it's, and so I talked to Ryan. I said, Ryan, I want to do another React 30 show. I want to do React Sketch. And he's like, what? Yes.
I was in the middle of typing, we should get John Gold. And then
to talk about React Sketch. Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. It's time to resurrect the podcast because React Sketch is awesome.
Well, I'm glad I'm bringing it back.
So why don't you tell us, John, a little bit about, introduce React Sketch and just tell us kind of why you made it.
And maybe start with you too, like a little bit about maybe what your role is at Airbnb, and because I'm sure that has a lot to do with why React Sketch even exists.
Sure. Okay. So for context, I'm like a designer, engineer, both hybrid. The word that we use at work is design technologist, but I just look at myself. I see myself as like a designer and a software engineer. I work at Airbnb, or a company that you might have heard of. And the design tools team. So it's basically my job to bring design and engineering closer together at work and just build kind of badass new tools for our designers and engineers to use every day. I can go into that a little bit more, or we can kind of come back to that. That might come out actually as we talk about React Sketch. But like put simply, React Sketch is a React renderer for Sketch. It targets Sketch as a rendering surface. So in the same way as you have React DOM, which renders to the DOM, React Native, which renders to native apps, React VR, which renders to VR, React Hardware, which renders to hardware. This is a React renderer for Sketch.
So it's probably the opposite of what most people's intuition is.
Yes, that was the thing that we've been dealing with for a while. Yeah, a lot of people thought it was / were hoping for a way to make idiomatic React components from Sketch, and this is just the opposite thing to that. This is essentially born out of a need for us to keep our design system in sync. So if you can imagine, we have a design system with hundreds of components spread across, let's see, at least 4 different platforms. So we have React Web, React Native, iOS, Android Native, probably a few others that I'm forgetting, like TOS. So we have like a lot of different surfaces, a lot of sources of truth.
When you server render too on the web.
We server render, yes. So we have the whole isomorphic thing going. Most of our stuff at this point, being server rendered to web, is like rendered via React Web. But there was this problem with inconsistency. There was a problem with our template files being out of sync with themselves, being out of sync with documentation, being out of sync with engineering implementations. I should clarify that when I talk about template files, I mean like Sketch, like UI kits. So, all of our templates, all of our colors, all of our type styles, that kind of thing.
So that's over my head. I barely know how to use Sketch. maybe it's worth talking a little bit more about what these template files are, or if it's not useful to talk about Sketch, I mean, feel free to skip it. But
sure, we can go into that. So our design workflow is relatively split into people creating and defining a system, people creating, defining, modifying our components and like propagating those out to people, and then designers, product designers day to day using those components to create screens, to create experiences for our users to use. In the same way as that a foundational technology team might be working on a component library, and then individual developers might be using that library. The same thing kind of goes for our designers. And there's like a workflow for contributing components back into the system and kind of propagating those out to everyone again. But the way that designers tend to be interacting with our design system is through these big sketch files that just have all of our components in different variations, all kind of laid out in grids. And they can go and copy and paste those in the document they're working on. And so we just ran into this problem where our engineering surfaces were often out of sync with each other. Now that's a problem that we can solve. You know, we can relatively easily keep we can relatively easily keep React Native in sync with iOS. Like I just wrote some code that generates Swift files from React. It's kind of cool, but it's also like a solved problem. Like we relatively easily know how to keep engineering, things in sync. But keeping these sketch files in sync just felt like a battle that we could never win. So if you imagine a file with hundreds of components, different color values, all of that kind of thing, and it's a living system. So, every day or every week, something changes. Mm-hmm. Just trying to coordinate updates to that and keep it all in sync with documentation and with code bases it felt like something that was just going to be like a spiraling source of pain that we just wouldn't be able to tackle. So, the way you solve that when you have like a repetitive task you don't really want to do by hand is you script it, right? That's how that is programming. Sketch has an API. It's kind of documented, mostly undocumented. To do the interesting stuff, you're basically like deconstructing private headers and writing this kind of, okay, so people complain about CSS and JS. With the Sketch's API, you're essentially with Sketch's API, you're essentially writing Cocoa in JS with none of the IDE support of Xcode, but also none of the ecosystem stuff of JavaScript. So we were like, well, square brackets and all this kind of thing is super painful. It's like an imperative API, and you can pretty much control anything in Sketch with these private headers and these kind of undocumented methods. It's like a
JavaScript Cocoa bridge. I remember those. Those used to exist, right? Like,
so it uses Cocoa script.
It's kind of like a bridge code that you use. Is that it?
Exactly, but it means that you're essentially writing Objective-C style code, in JavaScript. So you're like alloc in it. Yeah. So the one thing is that the syntax is kind of weird. The other thing is that it's not a great development environment. It's a bit of a pain to do. Also, it's like imperative, and I'm a functional programming fanboy, and I just refuse to write imperative code. Like I don't want to go there. I don't want to go there. I don't want to be like allocating layers and then adding things to layers step by step. It didn't seem scalable. We wanted to script Sketch, but we also wanted to do it in a way that felt in line with our beliefs about how we kind of build things. And so the obvious the observation there was React basically at its core is this declarative bridge over imperative APIs. It doesn't really matter if that's the document object model or UIKit or Arduino. The point is that you have this kind of declarative wrapper over these imperative APIs that you don't really want to touch more than you have to.
Mm-hmm. I want to use that, John. I want to steal that line from you. Don't worry, I'll always give you credit for that. but I think you just explained it better than I've really ever heard anybody say it before. That React is it's a way to put a declarative API over kind of this, various imperative APIs. React, the DOM being just one of them, right?
It could have been named Declarative-Fi.
It could have been. I mean, React also gives you a couple of other things that are nice, right? React gives you this way of, it gives you a way of thinking about components. It gives you a way of like thinking about functional interfaces, about this contract that render functions have. It's super composable. It's just a really great way of declaring design. And this, like at the simplest level, like for a design file, say you have some swatches. So there's like a color being printed out, and there's, I don't know, the color name and the color X. And say we want to calculate the accessibility, like the contrast ratio, and that's like a JavaScript file. Or say we want to have the text overlaid on the swatch, and we want to dynamically calculate, what color the text should be. These are things that we can do in pretty much like any programming paradigm, but just having like functional ways of expressing this stuff is incredibly powerful. So even for style guides, essentially, is what we're doing. It felt like, when you're like statically rendering stuff, well, it's still the perfect paradigm. Like people keep saying, there's this meme going around on the internet from some people, like React is great if you're doing like WYSI, like interactive UIs, but it's still not great for doing a blog. No, actually React is probably even better for doing a blog or for a marketing site or, anything like that. Like I think Gatsby is amazing. I think Next is amazing. You don't have to have interactivity for the React component model to like make a ton of sense. And I think it's just like
Sorry, I was just gonna say I haven't reached for any sort of templating library or anything since React. Like, with static stuff, I'm like, I still think about this in the language of React. I'm building something that displays in front of someone. Yeah.
I was generating.
It's just functions the whole way down, and it makes so much sense.
Yeah, I was just writing some code the other day, and it was like I need to generate some HTML, and I wasn't even thinking. Like the code wasn't even actually running on the client. It was actually going to run on the server, and it was going to server render. But it just felt like such a natural way to do it that I didn't even think about where it was going to be running, sort of how I was going to be using it. That the idea was, this is a good abstraction for declaring this kind of thing. So we just write it down, and then it turns out I have to run it in this such and such an environment. Turns out I have to run it on the server. Well, no big deal. But yeah, I think it kind of goes back to what you were saying, John, about how this is sort of a good sort of general purpose abstraction for doing lots of different kinds of tasks.
Okay, so where are we at with React Sketch? So Airbnb had this big design problem. You've got a lot of shared components for all these different targets that you render to, and trying to manage like, we changed the color of this button. How do you get that, propagate that change across all of the UI everywhere and make sure that everyone's consistent? Is that kind of...
Exactly.
So maybe we can use Sketch. Maybe we can render to Sketch instead of just having like a CSS file and a website that we go to, and it's like, okay, here are the design patterns at Airbnb. Please follow them. Instead, let's render our what do you call them, templates, our template files, or let's use Sketch and React together, render to Sketch. And now, how does that? What's the workflow like? How does that help everyone stay in sync with the design patterns that you have?
Right. So this project came in a number of phases. The first pass was us just thinking, what would it look like if we wrote? I think we just started actually with like a JSX like Pragma transform thing, and that was like the simplest version of this. And then we wrote a React renderer. At this point, like the API was, this was back in October last year. This was like a week of us hacking around, just trying to see if we could render something React-like into Sketch. A lot like the React Art API. So rectangles, lines, ovals, stars, or whatever. It looked a lot like you might imagine the primitives from a creative coding library to be, or like similar to processing, I guess.
Yeah.
And so that was fine for us doing, I don't know, like swatch templates, because it's essentially rectangles, and you know, it was all like Cartesian coordinates. It was all just like left and right, and this was okay, but it was already starting to strain, because we figured like the first pass of this system could be using rectangles and ovals to, you know, define swatches and I don't know, like typography styles. But down the line, we always wanted to figure out a way of also rendering components. Now, there are two ways we could have done that. Either we could have created a new source of truth or something that transformed, that that drew our components, that drew like rectangle by rectangle, drew all of our components using primitives like rectangle. But that felt like a whole bunch of work as well. That really felt like it was going to be a difficult problem, and we'd have introduced another, deprecated one source of truth and introduced another one, and it felt like not a great thing to be doing. So really, like, the masterstroke of this project was Leland Richardson. You said you've had him on before. He's an engineer here, mostly working on React Native stuff. But his insight was that if we just standardized on an API, if we just used view and text for everything, well, that's the same interface that React Native components have. That's the same interface that React Native web components have. That's the same interface that pretty much the React VR has. Like, it seems like there's this emerging specification for primitives of design systems.
There's even a repository that I think did Nicholas from Twitter start that? React Primitives?
That's actually Leland's project.
That's Leland's project. Okay.
Yeah.
But yeah, so we can get onto that in a second.
Nicholas does React Native Web, which I think is
I'm sorry.
idea.
Right.
Yeah. So this was like a masterstroke by switching to the same interface, the same contract across these platforms. Well, really suddenly we could, like, at the very least copy and paste code across, but really we could actually reuse components, like reuse the same things. So Leland's kind of pet project right now, and I think that's going to blow up this summer, I'm really excited about it, is React Primitives, which is, it's essentially like a, I don't know what the Gang of Four name for it would be. I guess it's like a proxy or a abstraction of, I don't know, I don't like object-oriented stuff.
Let's just be like functional program and make up a new crazy name.
The names make sense. They're good names.
Concrete proxy class.
React Primitives basically is an abstract or something that wraps underlying platform implementations. So it gives you a view and a text and an image and a few other things. But then your packager does the work of figuring out whether it should use like the React Native entry point or the React Web entry or the React Native Web entry point or the React Sketch entry point. So if you just like build all of your components from the ground up with React Primitives, well, then you can really render the same stuff anywhere.
Do you ever worry about maybe this isn't about React Sketch enough, but worry about the least common denominator problem with that idea?
In what way?
Well, I'm trying to think of a good example, but it just seems like let's take the vibration API. It doesn't work in Safari on the web. So if I'm building some sort of primitive about causing a vibration on the device, since I can't do that on desktop Safari or even web Safari or iOS Safari, not on any of my platforms.
So yeah, that's like a valid concern. The way that we handle it in like primitives land or React as a platform land is that primitives only exports the real lowest common denominator. So view, text, image, platform, I think is one. But things that don't make sense on other platforms, or touchable as another, things make sense on individual platforms, like Artboard only makes sense in Sketch, or shared text styles only make sense in Sketch, or let's see, like a light would only make sense in React VR. That's fine, and you can just import those things from those platforms. But using like the platform cascades that React Native introduced, so it looks first for say .ios.js files and then .js files, or with React Sketch, you're looking for .sketch.js files and then .js files. Like, your imports kind of cascade that way. It means that you can have entry points that slightly diverge for different platforms, and that's okay too. The point is that you start to build up design systems with stuff that works cross-platform, and then you can decorate it with stuff that isn't cross-platform later. Another example might be our web files Apollo for GraphQL, but for Sketch, we have like a kind of hacky GraphQL client. And so we can have separate entry points for the platforms importing their relative GraphQL thing. It's a little bit hacky right now, but it kind of works.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think you just have, you know, sort of the basic primitives: text, view, style sheet, you know, maybe some things to do with interactivity. Maybe you've got like a touch API or something. And then everything else sort of branches based on the file name if you need to specialize for a platform. So my big question is, you know, it's at a certain point, I think React Sketch has to overcome some organizational or like people issues, right? So you said you're a design technologist, which means, you know, you probably work in the design department or whatever at Airbnb, but you also, you know, implement some pieces of that. You know, at an organizational level, Airbnb, I'm not too familiar with Airbnb, the company, but, you know, I've worked in enough technology companies to know that there's like the design department and then there's the engineering department. And, you know, these people don't really have lunch together very often. So you need to kind of like, I mean, now that these sketch files are literally being generated from your React code, if somebody who, say they're a very strictly, you know, designer, I don't write code, if they need to somehow affect, you know, some of these template files, is, you know, how does that, or has that been a problem at Airbnb, or is everybody just like, hey, you know what, we're all just going to write code now and we're all going to be fine with it?
I wish. Yeah, it's definitely not a solved problem right now. So a bunch of things from that statement. Design and engineering haven't traditionally sat next to each other at lunch, but projects like this literally only came about because Leland and I eat dinner together. You know, like that's
absolutely.
And I think through things like this, we're hoping to, you know, we both have passions for each other's disciplines, and we're really hoping to be the point of the organization where like the design part of the Venn diagram hits the engineering part of the Venn diagram. And we're really hoping to bring design and engineering closer through work like this. Now, yeah, like the big elephant in the room is that not all designers can code. At our organization, I think it's probably representative of the industry as a whole that we have a spread from designers who have done React before and who are great with that. And we have maybe 2 handfuls of designers like that, through to designers who can maybe do some Framer or do some basic jQuery or something like that, through to designers doing some HTML, some CSS, through to designers who don't touch code at all. And we want to create a world that everyone is more efficient, everyone is empowered by these tools. So currently, the only way you can really interact with React Sketch is by writing React components. That's something that we're pretty aware of. The vision for it is actually outside of these component, like these template files, these sticker sheets. We want to go way beyond that. So when you can just treat Sketch as like this kind of idempotent rendering surface, you can render it to as many times as you want. So you can create component pickers where people can click and drag into Sketch, backed by real components. You can create, you know, a data provider backed by real GraphQL queries where people can wire up components and their props with their result of like GraphQL queries. And this is all stuff we can, you know, automatically internationalize. We can automatically split on screen sizes and show like matrices of different combinations of screen sizes. And this is all stuff that you can do in code right now, or pretty soon we'll build GUIs on top of it where designers can do all of the cool tricks that we've been kind of demoing, but without touching a line of code. On the subject of like editing components, again, this is something that we're aware of. By doing the system, we want to give designers more control of the system rather than less. And if you can have one source of truth that builds out to every different platform, that gives designers much more buy-in and much more transparency into the system than if they were simply designing mock-ups in Sketch and then waiting for an engineer to implement them. Now, the thing we haven't got to quite yet is how designers actually edit the system, which is another fair observation. The plan there is to build GUIs, again, that work with React as a source of truth, but are backed by GitHub and are backed by our actual component libraries. We're not quite there yet, but we're making like pretty good progress. And yeah, it's just kind of empowering to think of React Sketch as this kind of fundamental technology that solves some of our problems now, but will solve a lot of our problems going forward.
Interesting. So, so tell me a little bit about like maybe adoption at other companies. Is anybody else using this right now that you're aware of? Has anybody sort of pinged you on GitHub and been like, you've been working with anybody else, or is it mostly a sort of an Airbnb thing at the moment?
It's difficult to know exactly how many other people are using it. We've had great chats with people from other large companies. So at the React Wednesday meetup in San Francisco, every other Wednesday, there's been people from other companies expressing interest and playing around with it. But I feel like people tend to keep some of their design system stuff secret source. At Airbnb, we just try and be as open as possible with everything. So it's kind of hard to know exactly how things are being implemented, but I'm hoping that Facebook will implement it for their stuff soon. And I hope that other startups follow with that. It kind of comes with the caveat that it was kind of built to like a very specific niche, and we have a very specific component architecture that follows the kind of view and text kind of primitive level. So it might not yet be a drop-in replacement for people. So it's not like something people can necessarily use on brownfield projects today. But going forward, we hope that this is like provides a new model for how to architect React components.
Awesome. Well, hey, I think sorry, Ryan, do you have one last question?
I had one last question. I was going to say, can you give us like the elevator pitch of so I'm a designer who can code, and I'm working on some shared components, and I'm thinking I'm just going to build app that's our patterns library, and I'm just going to render it to the DOM to like show everybody. What's your elevator pitch on don't do that, use React Sketch instead because of XYZ?
Well, it's not use React Sketch instead, it's use React Sketch as well. I think by standardizing on this kind of component, this isn't an elevator pitch, this is like a broken elevator pitch where we're stuck together for a minute or two. By standardizing on these primitives, you open yourself up to every new technology that's going to come out in the React ecosystem over the next 5 or 10 years, hopefully. You're one code mod away from every exciting thing that we're going to have. So I would use React Sketch as well as designing stuff in the browser and just rendering stuff to both. Use each tool for what it's great for. So, the browser's great for style guide documentation. Sketch is actually a really good design tool. When you can render to things on the same level, and it's no more difficult or easier to render to the browser than it is to render to Sketch, why not both? It opens up a lot of interesting doors.
Cool.
That makes a lot of sense. John, I want to thank you for being our guest today on the show. React Sketch looks really, really cool. I think I understand a lot more about kind of why you built it now and what it could be useful for. Interested in looking into it further myself and, possibly recommending it. Ryan and I, we run a little training company where we train at a lot of different companies, a lot of large companies too. And I think a lot of them will have the same problem. So it'd be a good thing to, just sort of be more familiar with so we can tell other people about it as well.
That's awesome. Thanks so much for having me, guys.
Yeah, thanks. Take care, John.
Bye.